Her vows written in crimson ink. Caterina Esposito had spent years preparing to be a perfect wife, obedient, silent, untouched. But before she could be married off, she was taken by Enzo Costa, a man whose name her family only spoke in whispers. He smirked, his grip possessive as he pulled her closer. "You were never meant for him," he murmured. "And now, you'll never belong to anyone else." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Gilded Cage. The heavy brocade curtains of Caterina Esposito's bedroom window were drawn, but a sliver of the late afternoon sun still managed to pierce through, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room, opulent and vast, felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. Silk wallpaper, hand-painted with scenes of idyllic landscapes, mocked her with their depiction of freedom. Caterina sat at her antique dressing table, her reflection staring back at her with an unsettling hollowness. Her dark hair, usually meticulously styled, hung loose around her shoulders, a small act of rebellion in a life meticulously orchestrated by others. She traced the delicate lace of her ivory dressing gown, a garment chosen not for comfort, but for its virginal purity. In 3 days, she was to be married to Marco Salieri, a man twice her age, a man whose cold, calculating gaze sent shivers down her spine. It was a union arranged to solidify the alliance between the Esposito and Salieri families, a merger of power and influence, with her as the sacrificial lamb. Caterina's fingers tightened around a small, worn leather-bound book, a collection of poetry she'd hidden from her family. It was her only solace, the only place where she could explore emotions deemed inappropriate for a woman of her standing. Emotions like yearning, like defiance, like the desperate desire for a life beyond the suffocating expectations of her family. A soft knock on the door startled her. "Caterina?" It was her mother's voice, sharp and controlled, even through the thick mahogany. "Come in, Mama," Caterina replied, quickly tucking the book under a stack of pristine linens in a nearby drawer. Isabella Esposito entered the room, her presence filling the space with an air of both elegance and authority. Her tailored dress, the color of deep burgundy, accentuated her still striking figure. Her gaze, as always, was assessing, searching for any flaw in Caterina's presentation. "You look pale, Caterina," Isabella said, her voice laced with disapproval. "Are you still fretting about the wedding?" Caterina forced a smile.
"No, Mama.
Just a little tired." Isabella's lips thinned. "Tired? You have nothing to be tired about. You are being given the opportunity of a lifetime. Marco Salieri is a powerful man, a respected man. You will want for nothing. Except perhaps a say in my own future," Caterina thought bitterly, but the words remained unspoken. Years of training had taught her the futility of resistance. Her role was to be compliant, to be the perfect embodiment of Esposito grace and obedience. Isabella moved closer, her hand reaching out to smooth a stray strand of Caterina's hair. "Your father is pleased with how you've conducted yourself. He believes you will bring honor to our family."
Honor.
The word felt like a lead weight in Caterina's stomach. It was a concept that had been drilled into her since childhood, a constant reminder of her duty to uphold the Esposito name, to maintain the family's position in the intricate, often brutal, world they inhabited. A world where alliances were forged in blood and broken just as easily. "I will do my best, Mama," Caterina said, her voice a whisper. Isabella nodded, seemingly satisfied.
"Good.
"Now, Rosa will be here soon to help you prepare for dinner. Your father expects you to be particularly charming tonight. We have guests." Caterina's heart sank. Guests usually meant more scrutiny, more veiled threats disguised as polite conversation, more reminders of the life that awaited her. A life where her every move would be watched, her every word dissected. After Isabella left, Caterina walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtain. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens below. Beyond the high walls of the Esposito estate lay the city, a sprawling labyrinth of secrets and dangers. She'd always been sheltered from its harsh realities, kept safe within the confines of her gilded cage. But tonight, something felt different. A strange unease settled over her, a premonition of something shifting, something about to change. She closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of the roses that climbed the trellis outside her window. Their sweet fragrance mingled with the faintest whiff of something else, something sharper, more dangerous. It was a scent she couldn't quite place, a scent that sent a shiver of both fear and something else, something akin to anticipation, down her spine. It was the scent of smoke, distant but persistent, promising a fire that might consume everything she knew. She couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, the carefully constructed walls of her world were about to crumble. And she had no idea what lay on the other side. The uncertainty, terrifying as it was, carried a strange undercurrent of something else. A flicker of forbidden hope. Chapter 2. Whispers in the darkened hallways. The grand dining room of the Esposito estate was a testament to the family's wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow on the polished mahogany table, laden with silver cutlery and fine china. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats, expensive wine, and the underlying tension that always accompanied gatherings of this nature. Caterina sat beside her father, Don Antonio Esposito, her posture rigid, her smile fixed. Across the table, Marco Salieri's eyes followed her, their possessive gleam making her skin crawl. Tonight, however, the usual discomfort was amplified by the presence of another guest, Enzo Costa. He sat to Salieri's left, a dark, brooding presence amidst the calculated civility. Caterina had only heard whispers of Enzo Costa, the notorious enforcer of the Costa family, rivals of the Salieris, but uneasy allies of the Espositos. His name was synonymous with ruthlessness, a man who operated in the shadows, a man to be feared. He was younger than she expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that seemed to absorb the light. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He wore a tailored black suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and lean physique. There was an undeniable charisma about him, a dangerous allure that both terrified and intrigued her. Don Antonio was engaged in a heated discussion with Salieri about some business deal, their voices low and laced with veiled threats. Caterina tried to focus on the conversation, to appear interested, but her gaze kept drifting back to Enzo Costa. He was mostly silent, observing the exchange between her father and Salieri with a detached amusement that made her uneasy. At one point, their eyes met. His gaze was intense, unwavering, stripping away her carefully constructed facade. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, and she quickly looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a fleeting moment, but it left her shaken, her senses heightened. Caterina, her father's voice cut through her thoughts. You are quiet tonight. Is everything to your liking? She forced a smile. Yes, Papa. Everything is perfect. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Enzo Costa's lips curled into a faint smirk, as if he could see right through her. She felt a strange mix of resentment and something else, a flicker of defiance. She straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze again, this time holding it for a moment longer. There was a challenge in her eyes, a silent rebellion against the role she was forced to play. The dinner continued, a carefully choreographed dance of power and manipulation. Caterina played her part, offering polite smiles, answering questions with practiced grace, all the while feeling like a puppet on strings. But beneath the surface, something was stirring within her. The encounter with Enzo Costa, brief as it was, had awakened something dormant, a spark of resistance that she thought had been extinguished long ago. As the evening drew to a close, and the guests were preparing to leave, Caterina found herself momentarily alone in a dimly lit hallway. She leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Enzo Costa. He moved with a silent grace that was both predatory and captivating. He stopped a few feet away from her, his presence filling the narrow hallway. The caged bird sings a beautiful song, he said, his voice a low murmur that sent shivers down her spine. But it is still a song of captivity. Caterina's breath caught in her throat. His words were a direct reflection of her innermost thoughts, a confirmation of the unspoken understanding that had passed between them earlier. "And what would you know of captivity, Mr. Costa?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. He took a step closer, his eyes, dark and intense, locking with hers. "More than you might think, Principessa." The way he said the word, a common Italian endearment, felt different coming from him. It was both a challenge and a promise. "More than you might think." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of heat through her body. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "You were never meant for him," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze dropping to her lips. "You were meant for something more." His words hung in the air, a dangerous proposition, a forbidden temptation. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Enzo Costa straightened, his expression shifting back to the detached coolness he had displayed throughout the evening. "Until we meet again, Caterina Esposito," he said, his voice now devoid of the intimacy it had held moments before. He gave a slight bow, a gesture of mock politeness, and then he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged. Caterina stood there, frozen, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. His words, his touch, had shattered the carefully constructed walls of her composure. She touched her cheek, the ghost of his touch still lingering on her skin. She felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement, of dread and hope. The gilded cage had suddenly become unbearable, and the whispers in the darkened hallways had planted a seed of rebellion that she knew, with a terrifying certainty, was about to bloom. The seed had been planted, and there was no turning back. The game, whatever it was, had begun. Chapter 3. A Dance with the Devil's Shadow. Sleep evaded Caterina. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, a dizzying loop of Enzo Costa's intense gaze, his whispered words, the electric touch of his fingers on her skin. The grand bedroom, usually a suffocating symbol of her confinement, now felt charged with a strange energy, a sense of impending change. She tossed and turned in the silken sheets, her mind racing, her body thrumming with a nervous energy she couldn't explain. She rose from the bed, wrapping herself in a silk robe, and walked to the window. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the gardens below. The scent of roses, usually a comfort, now seemed to carry a hint of something darker, something more dangerous, a reminder of the encounter in the hallway. She thought of Marco Salieri, her betrothed, and a shiver of revulsion ran down her spine. His cold, calculating eyes, his possessive touch, the way he spoke of her as if she were a prized possession, a trophy to be displayed. The thought of spending her life with him was unbearable. Then, her thoughts shifted to Enzo Costa. He was everything Salieri was not. Dangerous, unpredictable, alluring. He was a shadow, a whisper in the dark, a man who lived outside the rigid rules of her world. And yet, he had seen something in her, something beyond the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world. He had seen the caged bird, yearning for freedom. A sudden noise startled her, a soft tapping at the window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered through the glass, and her breath caught in her throat. Enzo Costa was standing on the balcony outside her room, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. He gestured for her to open the window. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to alert the guards, to do anything but let him in. But her body, as if acting on its own accord, moved towards the window, her hand reaching for the latch. She slid the window open, the cool night air rushing into the room, carrying with it the scent of smoke and something else, something indefinably masculine. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room, making it feel smaller, more intimate. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent shivers down her spine. "I told you we would meet again. You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely audible. "If anyone sees you, they won't," he said, his voice confident, assured. He moved closer, his eyes locking with hers. I go where I please. She took a step back, her hand going to the neckline of her robe, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. Why are you here? She asked again, trying to regain some semblance of control. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the same spot he had touched earlier. The touch was just as electric, just as unsettling. I came to see you, he said, his voice a low murmur, to see if the caged bird was still dreaming of flying. She looked away, unable to hold his intense gaze. I don't know what you're talking about. He chuckled softly. Don't you? I think you do. I think you're tired of the gilded cage, Katerina. I think you're ready to break free. His words were like a key unlocking a door in her heart, a door she had kept tightly closed for years. She looked back at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. And if I am? She whispered. He took a step closer, his body almost touching hers. Then I might just be the one to help you do it. The air between them crackled with tension, with unspoken desires, with the dangerous allure of the forbidden. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. But be warned, Principessa, he whispered. Flying with me comes at a price. The price, she knew, was everything. Her family, her security, the life she had always known. But the thought of remaining in the gilded cage, of marrying Marco Salieri, was a price she was no longer willing to pay. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. What price? She asked, her voice steadier now, her fear giving way to a flicker of something else, something akin to excitement. The dance had begun, and she was ready to follow, even if it led her into the heart of darkness. He was the devil's shadow, and she, the willing captive, ready to embrace the fall. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a desperate, exhilarating sense of liberation. This was madness, she knew, but it was a madness she craved. Chapter 4. The Scent of Roses and Gunpowder. The price, Enzo said, his voice a husky whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them, is your complete trust. He held her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher the secrets hidden within. The moonlight illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the faint scar above his eyebrow, the intensity of his expression. Katerina's heart pounded in her chest. Trust. It was a word that held little meaning in her world, a world built on alliances, betrayals, and carefully guarded secrets. Trusting Enzo Costa, a man known for his ruthlessness, a man who represented everything her family stood against, was madness. And yet trust you? She echoed, her voice barely audible. Why should I trust you? He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Because I see you, Katerina. I see the fire behind the obedience, the longing behind the resignation. You're not like the others. You're not content with the gilded cage. He reached out, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jawline. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a wave of heat through her body. And you offer me an escape? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I offer you a choice, he corrected. A chance to live a life of your own choosing. A life where you are not a pawn in someone else's game. His gaze dropped to her lips, lingering there for a moment that felt like an eternity. A life with me. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. A life with him. It was a terrifying prospect, a leap into the unknown, a betrayal of everything she had been taught to believe. But it was also exhilarating, intoxicating, the promise of a freedom she had only dared to dream of. She looked away, her mind racing. Images flashed through her head, her father's disapproving frown, her mother's sharp reprimands, the cold, possessive gaze of Marco Salieri. The weight of their expectations, the suffocating pressure of her family's legacy, threatened to crush her. But then, she saw Enzo's face, his intense eyes, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. She saw the promise of something different, something more. A life lived on her own terms, a life where she could be herself. And what if I refuse? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. His smile faded, replaced by a look of, was it disappointment? or something else. Then you will marry Salieri, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. You will live the life that has been chosen for you, a life of quiet desperation. And I will disappear back into the shadows. The thought of him disappearing, of never seeing him again, sent a pang of something akin to regret through her. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this sudden connection to a man she barely knew, a man who was her enemy in every way that mattered. She looked back at him, her eyes searching his. And what if I accept? His smile returned, this time softer, more genuine. Then you will have to trust me completely, Katerina. You will have to follow my lead, without question, without hesitation. He paused, his gaze intensifying. You will have to be brave.
Brave.
It was a word she had never associated with herself. She had always been the obedient daughter, the dutiful fiancée, the perfect Esposito. But now, looking into Enzo Costa's eyes, she felt a spark of courage ignite within her, a defiance she had never known she possessed. The scent of roses from the garden below mingled with the faint smell of gunpowder that clung to Enzo's clothes, a strange, intoxicating blend of beauty and danger. It was a perfect reflection of the choice she was about to make, a choice that would forever alter the course of her life. She began, her voice trembling, then steadied herself. I accept. The word hung in the air, a commitment, a turning point. Enzo's smile widened, a flash of triumph in his eyes. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, possessive, sending a jolt of electricity through her. Then come with me, Katerina, he said, his voice low and urgent.
Now.
Before it's too late. He didn't wait for her to answer. He pulled her towards the window, towards the balcony, towards the darkness that awaited them. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at the opulent bedroom, the symbol of her gilded cage. Then, she took a deep breath and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, ready to embrace the unknown, with a man she barely knew, but somehow, instinctively, trusted. The plunge was taken. The die was cast. There was no safety net, only the exhilarating, terrifying freefall into a new reality. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Life Unlived. The night air was cool against Katerina's skin, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the Esposito estate. She clung to Enzo's hand as he led her across the dew-kissed lawn, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sounds of the city. She was barefoot, her silk robe billowing around her, a stark image of vulnerability against the backdrop of the imposing mansion. She glanced back at the house, her former prison, now receding into the darkness. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her, fear, excitement, guilt, and a strange sense of liberation. She had defied her family, betrayed her betrothal, and thrown her lot in with a man who was, by all accounts, her enemy. Where are we going? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the chirping of crickets. Enzo didn't answer, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. He led her through a hidden gate in the garden wall, a passage she hadn't known existed. They were on a narrow, winding path, shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. She stumbled, and he caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. She could feel the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart, the strength in his arms. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this closeness to a man, this sense of being protected. Careful, he murmured, his voice close to her ear. The path is treacherous. His words were a metaphor for her entire situation. She had embarked on a treacherous path, a journey into the unknown, with no guarantee of safety or happiness. But she couldn't turn back. She had made her choice, and she had to see it through. They reached a clearing, where a sleek, black car was waiting, its engine idling softly. Enzo opened the door for her, and she slid inside, sinking into the plush leather seat. The interior of the car was dark, intimate, the scent of leather and Enzo's subtle cologne filling her senses. He got in beside her, starting the engine, and the car surged forward, leaving the Esposito estate behind. As they drove, Katerina watched the city lights blur past, a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes. She felt a sense of disorientation, as if she were floating in a dream, unsure of where she was or where she was going. "Who are you, Enzo Costa?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence. He glanced at her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I am the man who stole you away from a life you didn't want," he said. "The man who offered you a choice." "But why me?" she persisted. "Why risk everything for me?" He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Let's just say," he said finally, "I saw something in you that I couldn't ignore. A spark of defiance, a yearning for something more. Something I understand." She sensed a hidden depth in his words, a hint of a past he wasn't ready to reveal. She wondered about his life, his motivations, the reasons behind his actions. He was an enigma, a mystery she was determined to unravel. The car pulled up to a small, unassuming building in a quiet neighborhood, far from the opulent mansions of her family. It was a stark contrast to the life she had known, but it felt strangely welcoming. Enzo led her inside, into a sparsely furnished apartment. It was clean and tidy, but lacked the personal touches that would make it a home. There were no family portraits, no ornate decorations, no signs of a life lived within its walls. "This is yours?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "It's a safe house," he corrected. "One of many. No one knows about this place." She looked around, feeling a sense of unease. It was a place of anonymity, a place where people disappeared, a place where secrets were kept. It was a reflection of Enzo's life, a life lived in the shadows. He saw the apprehension in her eyes. "You're safe here, Katerina," he said, his voice softening. "I promise you." She wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to trust him, but the echoes of her old life, the warnings about the Costa family, the ingrained fear of betrayal, still lingered in her mind. She was a stranger in a strange land, with a man she barely knew, a man who held her future in his hands. The echoes of a life unlived, a life of quiet obedience and stifled dreams, seemed to mock her from the shadows. But there was no regret, only a quiet determination to face whatever lay ahead. The old life was gone, and a new, uncertain one had begun. The silence of the safe house was a blank canvas, waiting for a new story to be painted upon it. Chapter 6. Beneath the velvet cloak of night. The safe house was quiet, almost eerily so, after the constant hum of activity that had permeated the Esposito estate. Katerina stood by the window, looking out at the darkened street below. The city lights seemed distant, muffled, as if she were viewing them through a veil. She felt a profound sense of isolation, cut off from everything she had ever known. Enzo had disappeared into another room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was wearing only the silk robe she had fled in, a flimsy garment that offered little protection against the cold reality of her situation. She thought of her family, of their reaction to her disappearance. Her father's fury, her mother's disappointment, the scandal that would undoubtedly erupt. She imagined the whispers, the accusations, the shame that would be heaped upon the Esposito name. A pang of guilt pierced her heart. She had hurt them, betrayed them, even though they had never truly understood her. She had always been a pawn in their game, a means to an end, but they were still her family. But then, she thought of Marco Salieri, of the life that awaited her with him, a life of cold formality, of suffocating control, of a loveless marriage. The thought sent a shiver of revulsion down her spine. She had escaped that fate, at least for now. Enzo returned, carrying a bundle of clothes. "These might fit you," he said, his voice neutral. "They belong to someone who used to stay here." She took the clothes, her fingers brushing against his. The touch sent a jolt of awareness through her. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. He was an enigma, a man of secrets, a man who lived in the shadows. And yet, she had entrusted her life to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned away. There's a bathroom down the hall, he said. You can change in there. She retreated to the bathroom, a small, functional space with a shower, a sink, and a toilet. She stripped off the silk robe, the last vestige of her former life, and examined the clothes Enzo had given her. They were simple, practical, a pair of dark jeans, a soft cotton sweater, a plain white t-shirt. They were a far cry from the elegant gowns she was accustomed to wearing, but they felt liberating. She dressed quickly, the unfamiliar fabric feeling strange against her skin. She looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, almost unrecognizable. She was no longer Caterina Esposito, the dutiful daughter, the soon-to-be bride. She was someone else, someone new. She emerged from the bathroom, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. Enzo was sitting on the sofa, his gaze fixed on the window. He turned as she entered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "Better?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier now. "Much better." He gestured to the sofa. "Sit down, Caterina. We need to talk." She sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, with the weight of their situation. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice direct. He leaned back, his expression serious. "Now we wait," he said. "We see how your family reacts. We see what Salieri does." "And what if they come after me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, reassuring.
They won't, he said.
"I won't let them." His words, his touch, sent a wave of warmth through her. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She had placed her trust in him, and she had to believe that he would protect her. The velvet cloak of night seemed to press in on them, isolating them in their small, hidden world. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city. She felt a strange sense of intimacy with Enzo, a connection forged in the crucible of their shared danger. He was her captor, her protector, her something else. Something she couldn't quite define. The future was uncertain, fraught with peril, but in this moment, under the cover of darkness, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense of possibility. She was no longer a caged bird, but a creature of the night, flying alongside a shadow, towards an unknown destination. And for the first time in her life, she felt alive. Chapter 7. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The silence in the safe house was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an old clock on the wall, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of the precariousness of their situation. Caterina sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Enzo was pacing restlessly, his energy filling the small room. She had so many questions, so many uncertainties, but she hesitated to voice them. She didn't want to appear weak, to show her fear. She wanted to be strong, to be worthy of the risk he had taken. "Tell me about yourself, Enzo," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but firm. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice guarded. "I am what you see. A soldier. A protector. A man who does what needs to be done. But there's more to you than that," she persisted. "You said you understood me. You said you saw something in me."
"Why?"
He walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened street. His back was to her, his shoulders tense. She could sense his internal struggle, his reluctance to reveal himself. "I grew up in a world similar to yours," he said, his voice low and distant. "A world of expectations, of obligations, of limitations. My father was a powerful man, a respected man, but he was also cruel. He demanded obedience, loyalty, above all else." Caterina listened intently, her heart aching for the young boy he must have been, trapped in a world of violence and control. She saw a reflection of her own life in his words, a shared experience of suffocating expectations. "I rebelled," he continued, his voice laced with bitterness. "I refused to be his puppet. I chose my own path. And what was that path? She asked softly. He turned back to face her, his eyes dark and intense. A path of violence, he said. A path of revenge. A path I thought would lead to freedom. He paused, his gaze searching hers.
But it didn't, he said.
It led to more darkness, more pain, more emptiness. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the regret, the longing for something he had lost, or perhaps never had. She understood him, in a way she had never understood anyone before. And then I saw you, he said, his voice softening. I saw the same fire in you, the same yearning for something more. And I wanted to help you find it. I wanted to give you the choice I never had. His words resonated deeply within her. He had seen her, truly seen her, beyond the facade she presented to the world. He had recognized her yearning for freedom, her desire for a life of her own choosing. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with emotion. For seeing me, for saving me. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less hardened. I didn't save you, Katerina, he said. You saved yourself. You had the courage to walk away, to choose a different path. He moved closer, sitting beside her on the sofa. The distance between them was smaller now, the air charged with a different kind of tension, a sense of shared understanding, of mutual respect. But what now? She asked, her voice returning to the present, to the uncertainties that lay ahead. Now, he said, his voice firm, we fight. We fight for your freedom. We fight for us. The word us hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. It was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of a bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of their shared danger. The weight of unspoken words, of unacknowledged desires, pressed down on them, creating an atmosphere of both intimacy and tension. They were two souls, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to each other for survival, for hope, for something more. The future was a blank page, waiting to be written, but for now, in this shared moment of vulnerability, they had found a connection, a fragile alliance, in the heart of darkness. Chapter 8. A promise forged in fear and desire. The word us echoed in Katerina's mind, a dangerous, exhilarating sound. She looked at Enzo, her heart pounding in her chest. His eyes, dark and intense, held hers captive. She saw a reflection of her own conflicted emotions, fear, desire, uncertainty, and a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in years' hope. Us, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. We're in this together, Katerina. Whether you like it or not. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, possessive, sending a shiver of both apprehension and excitement through her. But your family, she began, her voice trailing off. The Espositos, the Costas, they're enemies. Not enemies, he corrected. Rivals. There's a difference. And sometimes, rivals can find common ground. But the alliance with Salieri, she stammered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had shattered a carefully constructed alliance, a union that had been years in the making. The consequences would be severe. Enzo's expression hardened. Salieri is a snake, he said, his voice laced with venom. He cares only for power, for control. He would have crushed you, Katerina. He would have taken everything from you. She knew he was right. She had seen the coldness in Salieri's eyes, the possessiveness in his touch. She had been a pawn in his game, a means to an end. But my father, she said, her voice filled with guilt. He'll never forgive me. Enzo's hand tightened on her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. Your father cares more for the Esposito name than he does for your happiness, he said. He made his choice. You made yours. His words were harsh, but she knew they were true. Her father had always prioritized the family's reputation, their standing in the intricate world of the mafia, above her own well-being. But what if they come after us? She asked, her voice trembling. What if they try to hurt you? He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a thrill of fear and excitement through her. Let them try, he said. I'm not afraid of them. She believed him. He was Enzo Costa, the enforcer, the shadow, the man who lived outside the rules. He was a force to be reckoned with. But she couldn't help but fear for him, for his safety. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. I'll protect you, Caterina, he whispered. I promise you. No one will hurt you. Not Salieri, not your father, not anyone. His words, his touch, his scent, overwhelmed her senses. She felt a strange mixture of terror and desire, of vulnerability and strength. She was drawn to him, to his darkness, to his dangerous allure. And what about you? She asked, her voice barely audible. What do you want from me, Enzo? He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. I want you to be free, Caterina, he said. I want you to be yourself. To live the life you deserve. His words were noble, selfless. But she sensed something more, something hidden beneath the surface. She saw a flicker of desire in his eyes, a hunger that mirrored her own. He leaned in again, his lips inches from hers. And I want you, he whispered, his voice husky with desire. The air between them crackled with electricity, with unspoken longing, with the dangerous thrill of the forbidden. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a question, a promise. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding, her senses reeling. She had never been kissed before, never been touched with such tenderness, such desire. She responded instinctively, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, tentative at first, then with growing passion. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of two souls seeking solace in each other's arms. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a promise forged in fear and desire. A promise that would bind them together, for better or for worse, in the dangerous world they inhabited. The kiss was a turning point, a moment of no return. It was the acknowledgement of the undeniable, the crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. It was the beginning of something new, something dangerous, something beautiful. Chapter 9. The cracks in the family armor. The kiss lingered, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. Caterina, breathless and disoriented, pulled back slightly, her eyes searching Enzo's. The intensity of his gaze, the raw emotion she saw reflected there, both thrilled and frightened her. Enzo, she whispered, her voice trembling. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. Don't be afraid, Principessa, he murmured. I won't let anything happen to you. His words were reassuring, but she knew the reality of their situation was far more complex. They were caught in a web of family loyalties, rivalries, and long-standing feuds. Their newfound connection, this fragile bond forged in the heat of the moment, was a threat to everything she had ever known. A sudden, insistent ringing shattered the intimacy of the moment. Enzo stiffened, his expression shifting from tenderness to guarded alertness. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a burner phone, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the screen. It's Alessandro, he said, his voice tight. Alessandro, Caterina knew, was Enzo's second in command, his most trusted lieutenant. He answered the phone, his voice low and curt. Caterina couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Enzo's face, her heart pounding with apprehension. His expression grew darker, his jaw clenching, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone.
When?
He asked, his voice sharp. How many? He listened for a moment longer, then ended the call, his face a mask of grim determination. He turned to Caterina, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else concern. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What's happened? Salieri, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. He's made his move. He's demanding your return. He's threatening war. Caterina's blood ran cold. She had expected retaliation, but the speed and ferocity of Salieri's response were terrifying. She had ignited a powder keg, and the explosion was about to engulf them all. My father, she began, her voice trembling. What about my father? Enzo hesitated, his expression softening slightly. Your father, he's siding with Salieri, he said. He's demanding your return as well. He's disowned you. The words hit her like a physical blow. Disowned. She had been cast out, rejected by her own family, sacrificed to maintain a fragile alliance. The pain was sharp, agonizing, a deep wound to her heart. So, what do we do? She asked, blinking the sting away.
There was steel in her spine now.
We fight, Enzo said, his voice resolute. We fight for your freedom. We fight for us. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. But we need to move.
Now.
This place is no longer safe. He led her to a back door, hidden behind a heavy curtain. They stepped out into a narrow alleyway, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the safe house. Where are we going? She asked, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space.
Somewhere they won't find you, he said.
Somewhere safe. He guided her through a maze of back streets, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. She clung to his hand, trusting him implicitly, her fear overshadowed by a growing sense of determination. She had made her choice. She had chosen freedom, she had chosen Enzo, and she would face the consequences, whatever they may be. She was no longer the obedient daughter, the dutiful fiancée. She was a woman fighting for her life, for her love, for her future. The cracks in the family armor had widened, revealing the rot and decay beneath the surface. And she was no longer willing to be a part of it. She was ready to break free, completely and irrevocably. The old world was crumbling, and she would rise from the ashes, a new, stronger version of herself. Chapter 10. Where Loyalty and Longing Collide. Enzo led Caterina through the labyrinthine alleyways, a silent, watchful presence beside her. She clung to his hand, her senses on high alert, every shadow, every sound, a potential threat. The city, once a familiar backdrop to her sheltered life, now felt alien and dangerous. They reached a nondescript garage, its metal door scarred and weathered. Enzo produced a key, unlocking the door with a metallic clang that echoed in the stillness of the night. Inside, a vintage motorcycle, gleaming black and chrome, stood waiting. Caterina stared at the machine, her eyes widening in surprise. "We're going on that?" she asked, her voice a mixture of apprehension and excitement. Enzo smiled, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "It's faster than a car," he said, "and less conspicuous." "Can you ride?" She shook her head. "I've never been on a motorcycle before." He handed her a helmet, its dark visor concealing her face. "Hold on tight," he said. "And trust me." She put on the helmet, the unfamiliar weight feeling strangely comforting. She climbed onto the back of the motorcycle, her arms wrapping around Enzo's waist, her body pressed against his. The leather of his jacket was cool against her cheek, the scent of him, a mix of leather, smoke, and something indefinably masculine, filling her senses. He started the engine, the roar of the motorcycle vibrating through her body. It was a powerful, exhilarating sound, a symbol of freedom and escape. They sped off into the night, the wind whipping through her hair, the city lights blurring past. She held on tight, her fear giving way to a strange sense of exhilaration. She had never felt so alive, so free, so connected to another human being. She trusted Enzo, implicitly, with her life, with her future. They drove for what seemed like hours, leaving the city behind, heading towards the outskirts, towards the unknown. Caterina had no idea where they were going, but she didn't care. She was with Enzo, and that was all that mattered. Finally, they arrived at a secluded villa, nestled in the hills overlooking the city. It was a beautiful, sprawling structure with terraced gardens, a sparkling pool, and breathtaking views. It was a far cry from the sterile safe house, a place of refuge, a place of possibility. Enzo led her inside. The villa was surprisingly warm and inviting, with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and the scent of fresh flowers. It felt like a home, a place where someone actually lived, a stark contrast to the temporary shelters she had experienced so far. "Whose house is this?" she asked, her voice echoing slightly in the spacious living room. "It belongs to a friend," Enzo said, his voice evasive. "Someone who owes me a favor. Someone who won't betray us." She sensed a hidden story behind his words, a web of connections and obligations that she didn't fully understand. But she trusted him. She had to. "You're safe here, Katerina," he said, his voice softening. "I promise you." He led her to a bedroom, a beautiful, spacious room with a large bed, a fireplace, and a balcony overlooking the gardens. It was a room fit for a princess, a room that seemed to belong to another world, another life.
"Get some rest," he said.
"You've had a long night." He turned to leave, but she stopped him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Enzo," she said, her voice hesitant. "Stay with me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and something else, tenderness. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her as she undressed, her movements slow and deliberate. She was no longer shy, no longer afraid. She was a woman, awakened, her desires unleashed. The collision of loyalty and longing that defined her life was distilled into this very moment. The choice was hers, and hers alone. She stood before him, vulnerable yet strong, ready to embrace the unknown, ready to embrace him. Chapter 11. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. Katerina stood before Enzo, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting shadows on her skin. She had shed the borrowed clothes, the last remnants of her flight from the safe house, and now stood wrapped only in a silk robe that Enzo had found in a drawer, a deep emerald green that contrasted with the ivory of her skin. It was a garment clearly meant for someone else, a ghost of the villa's unknown occupant, but on Katerina, it felt like a declaration, a claiming of space, of self. Enzo watched her, his gaze intense, unwavering. The air between them crackled with unspoken desire, with the weight of their shared vulnerability, with the dangerous path they had chosen. He had seen her fear, her defiance, her strength. Now he saw her beauty. She untied the robe, letting it slip from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She stood before him, naked and unashamed, her body bathed in the soft light. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient daughter of Don Esposito. She was a woman, awakened, her desires unleashed. He rose from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of her shoulder, the line of her collarbone, the swell of her breast. His touch was gentle, reverent, sending shivers of anticipation through her. "You are beautiful, Katerina," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and trust. She had never been with a man before, never experienced this kind of intimacy, this raw, untamed desire. But with Enzo, she felt safe. Safe to explore, safe to surrender, safe to be herself. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative touch, a question, a promise. She responded instinctively, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, passionate, desperate, a release of all the pent-up emotions, all the fears, all the longings that had been simmering beneath the surface. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed, laying her gently on the soft sheets. He followed her down, his body covering hers, his weight a welcome pressure. He kissed her again, his lips trailing down her neck, her shoulder, her breast. She arched her back, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body responding to his touch with an eagerness that surprised her. She had never felt so alive, so desired, so free. The night was filled with whispered words, with soft touches, with the joining of two bodies, two souls, seeking solace in each other's arms. It was a night of passion, of tenderness, of discovery. It was a night that would forever change them, binding them together in a way that neither of them had anticipated. As the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, Katerina lay in Enzo's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt a sense of peace, of contentment, that she had never known before. But even in this moment of tranquility, she knew their journey was far from over. They were still caught in a web of family loyalties, rivalries, and betrayals. The unveiling of hidden truths was just beginning. She looked up at Enzo, his eyes closed, his face relaxed in sleep. She traced the line of his jaw, the scar above his eyebrow, the faint stubble on his chin. "Enzo," she whispered, her voice soft. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at her, a smile gracing his lips. "Good morning, Principessa," he murmured. "Tell me," she said, her voice serious. "Tell me everything. About your family, about your past, about everything." He sighed, his smile fading. He knew this moment would come, the moment when he would have to reveal the hidden truths, the secrets he had kept guarded for so long. He knew that their future, their love, depended on it. He sat up, pulling her close, holding her as if he would never let go. And then, he began to speak, his voice low and filled with the weight of years, the burden of a past that haunted him still. The story he unfolded was one of betrayal, violence, and a desperate search for redemption. A story that would test Katerina's trust, her love, and her courage to the very limit. Chapter 12. A tapestry of secrets and lies. Enzo's voice, low and resonant, filled the room, weaving a tapestry of secrets and lies, of family betrayals and blood feuds. He spoke of his childhood, of a father who ruled with an iron fist, a man who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience, a man who saw his own son as a weapon, a tool to be used in his endless quest for power. "My father, Don Carlo Costa, was a man feared and respected in equal measure," Enzo began, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back at a distant, painful past. "He built his empire on violence and intimidation, on broken promises and shattered lives. I was his heir, his prized possession, groomed from birth to follow in his footsteps." Katerina listened intently, her heart aching for the young boy he must have been, trapped in a world of darkness and cruelty. She held his hand, her fingers interlaced with his, offering silent comfort and support. "I tried to please him," Enzo continued, his voice laced with bitterness.
"I trained, I fought, I obeyed."
"I became the enforcer, the shadow, the man who carried out his dirty work. I thought I could earn his respect, his love. But it was never enough. He always demanded more." He paused, his gaze shifting to Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and shame. "I did terrible things in his name," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Things I can never take back. Things that haunt me still." She squeezed his hand, her heart breaking for the pain she saw in his eyes. "It wasn't your fault, Enzo," she said. "You were a child, trapped in a world you didn't create." He shook his head. "I made choices, Katerina," he said. "I could have refused. I could have run away. But I didn't. I was too afraid. Too weak." "You were not weak," she said fiercely. "You were brave. You survived." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And then I met Isabella," he said, his voice softening. Katerina stiffened, her hand tightening in his. Isabella. Her mother. The name sent a jolt of shock through her. "Isabella Esposito?" she asked, her voice trembling. Enzo nodded.
"Before she married your father," he said.
"Before the alliance, before the feud. We were young. And we were in love." Katerina stared at him, her mind reeling. Her mother and Enzo? It was impossible, unthinkable. And yet she saw the truth in his eyes, the pain, the longing, the regret. He told her the story of their forbidden love, a secret romance that blossomed in the shadows, a brief, fleeting moment of happiness in a world of violence and control. He spoke of their dreams, their plans to escape, to build a life together, a life free from the constraints of their families. "But it wasn't meant to be," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Our families found out. They forbade it. They threatened us. They separated us." He paused, his gaze locking with Katerina's. "Your father, he offered my father a deal," he said.
"En alliance."
"A marriage between you and Salieri. In exchange, Isabella would marry him. Caterina's blood ran cold. Her own mother, a pawn in a game of power, just like her. A life sacrificed for the sake of family ambition. My father, he forced Isabella to marry him. Enzo continued. He threatened to kill me if she refused. She chose to save my life. She sacrificed her own happiness for mine. The tears streamed down Caterina's face, tears of anger, of grief, of understanding. She saw her mother in a new light, a woman trapped by circumstance, a woman who had made a courageous choice, a woman who had loved and lost. And that's why you took me, Caterina whispered, her voice choked with emotion. To avenge her? To punish my father? Enzo shook his head. No, Caterina, he said. It wasn't about revenge.
It was about you.
I saw you, trapped in the same gilded cage that Isabella had been in. I saw your fire, your spirit, your yearning for freedom. I couldn't let you suffer the same fate. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I did it for you, Caterina, he said, his voice filled with sincerity.
And I did it for me.
Because I fell in love with you. His words, his confession, hung in the air, a testament to the tangled web of secrets and lies that had brought them together. The tapestry of their past, woven with threads of love, betrayal, and sacrifice, was finally revealed. And in that moment, Caterina knew that she loved him too, this man of shadows, this man of violence, this man who had shown her the true meaning of freedom. The knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating, a leap of faith into an uncertain future. But she was ready. She was ready to fight for their love, for their future, for their us. Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. Enzo's confession hung in the air, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of their pasts. Caterina looked at him, her heart overflowing with a love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had found solace, understanding, and a fierce, untamed passion in the arms of a man who was, by all accounts, her family's enemy. But the world outside their secluded haven remained a dangerous place, a battleground of shifting alliances and long-standing feuds. The price of their freedom, the cost of their love, was yet to be fully realized. What do we do now, Enzo? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, a protective embrace that offered a momentary respite from the storm that raged outside. We fight, Caterina, he said, his voice resolute. We fight for our future. We fight for the right to be together. But fighting, she knew, meant facing their families, facing Salieri, facing the consequences of their defiance. It meant risking everything, including their lives.
How?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. How can we possibly win against them? They have all the power, all the resources. Enzo smiled, a faint, determined smile that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement through her. We have something they don't have, he said. We have each other. And we have the truth on our side. He explained his plan, a daring, audacious scheme to expose the lies, the betrayals, the corruption that had festered within their families for generations. It was a risky gamble, a desperate attempt to break the cycle of violence and control that had defined their lives.
We need allies, he said.
People we can trust. People who are tired of the old ways, people who are willing to fight for a better future. He mentioned names, people within their families, people within the other families, people she had known all her life, people she had never suspected of harboring secret resentments, secret desires for change. It won't be easy, Caterina, he warned. There will be betrayals, there will be sacrifices, there will be bloodshed. Are you ready for this? She looked at him, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient daughter of Don Esposito. She was a woman awakened, a woman in love, a woman ready to fight for her freedom. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm. I'm with you, Enzo. Always. He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, their love, their shared destiny. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of defiance, of a future they were determined to create, together. The The days that followed were a blur of activity. Secret meetings, whispered conversations, coded messages. Enzo and Katerina worked tirelessly, gathering allies, building a coalition of those who were willing to challenge the established order. They were playing a dangerous game, a game of cat and mouse, where one wrong move could cost them everything. Katerina discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer afraid, no longer willing to be a pawn in someone else's game. She was a warrior, fighting alongside the man she loved, fighting for a future where they could be together, free from the constraints of their families, free from the shadows of the past. But the price of freedom, the cost of love, was steep. They faced constant threats, betrayals, close calls. They lived on the edge, their lives hanging in the balance. And yet, their love for each other grew stronger, deeper, more resilient with each passing day. It was a love forged in the crucible of adversity, a love that would either destroy them or make them invincible. The stakes were higher than ever, the danger more palpable, but their resolve remained unshaken. They were in this together until the very end. Chapter 14. In the eye of the gathering storm. The villa, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage of a different sort. The beauty of the surroundings, the breathtaking views, the luxurious amenities, were a stark contrast to the tension that permeated the air. Katerina and Enzo were preparing for war, a war against their families, a war against the deeply ingrained traditions and power structures of their world. They spent their days strategizing, making contacts, gathering information, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Enzo was a whirlwind of activity, his phone constantly ringing, his face etched with a mixture of determination and concern. Katerina, while initially overwhelmed, found herself drawn into the intricate web of planning, her sharp mind and innate understanding of the subtle nuances of their world proving invaluable. She discovered a talent for strategy, for anticipating her enemies' moves, for seeing the cracks in their armor. She was no longer the passive observer, the obedient daughter. She was an active participant, a force to be reckoned with. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Enzo turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and worry. "You've changed, Katerina," he said, his voice soft. "You're not the same woman I took from the Esposito estate." She smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "I'm not," she agreed. "I've found myself.
I've found my strength. I've found you."
He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring, a constant source of comfort in this turbulent world.
"I'm proud of you," he said.
"But I'm also afraid. Afraid for you. Afraid of what might happen." She squeezed his hand, her heart aching for the burden he carried, the responsibility he felt for her safety. "We're in this together, Enzo," she said. "We'll face whatever comes, together." He nodded, his gaze locking with hers. "I know," he said. "But promise me something, Katerina. Promise me that if anything happens to me, you'll keep fighting. You'll keep going. You'll survive." Her breath caught in her throat. The thought of losing him, of being alone again, was unbearable. But she knew he was right. She had to be strong. She had to be prepared for anything. "I promise," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But you have to promise me the same thing." He smiled, a sad, tender smile. "I promise," he said. They sat in silence for a moment, the gathering storm of their impending conflict looming over them. The beauty of the sunset, the tranquility of the surroundings, were a stark contrast to the violence and betrayal that awaited them. Suddenly, a sharp, insistent ringing shattered the stillness. Enzo's phone. He answered it, his expression shifting from tenderness to guarded alertness. Katerina watched him, her heart pounding with apprehension. "What is it?" she asked as he ended the call. His face was grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination.
"It started," he said.
"Salieri's men, they're on their way. They know where we are." The eye of the storm had arrived. The time for planning, for preparation was over. The time for fighting had begun. Katerina stood up, her back straight, her shoulders squared. She was no longer afraid. She was ready. She was a warrior, fighting for her freedom, fighting for her love, fighting for her future. She looked at Enzo, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "Let them come," she said. "We're ready for them." The peace was shattered, the battle lines drawn. There was no turning back now. Only the fight. Chapter 15. Scars of the past, flames of the future. The night air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the distant sound of approaching vehicles. Katerina and Enzo stood on the balcony, their figures silhouetted against the faint glow of the city lights. They were armed, prepared, their faces set with grim determination. "They're here," Enzo said, his voice low and steady. Katerina nodded, her hand gripping the pistol he had given her. She had never fired a gun before, but Enzo had shown her how, drilling her repeatedly until she felt a measure of confidence. She was still terrified, but her fear was overshadowed by a fierce determination to survive, to protect Enzo, to fight for their future. The first wave of Salieri's men stormed the villa, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. The quiet of the night was shattered by the sounds of gunfire, of shattering glass, of shouts and screams. Enzo and Katerina fought back, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They moved through the villa, a deadly dance of predator and prey, taking down Salieri's men one by one. Katerina discovered a ruthlessness she never knew she possessed. She was fighting for her life, for her love, for her freedom. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient daughter of Don Esposito. She was a warrior, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. But Salieri's men were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Enzo and Katerina were forced to retreat, moving from room to room, fighting for every inch of ground. At one point, Enzo was hit, a bullet grazing his arm. Katerina cried out in alarm, but he waved her off, his face grimacing in pain. "I'm fine," he said, his voice strained. "Keep moving." They reached the balcony, their escape route cut off. They were trapped, surrounded, outnumbered. "Enzo," Katerina said, her voice filled with despair. "What do we do?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "We fight," he said. "Until the end." He pulled her close, kissing her fiercely, a kiss of desperation, of longing, of farewell. It was a kiss that spoke of a love that would transcend even death. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the chaos. The roar of motorcycles. A group of riders, their faces hidden behind helmets, stormed the villa, their weapons blazing. It was Alessandro, Enzo's second in command, and his loyal men. They had arrived just in time. The tide of the battle turned. Salieri's men, caught off guard, were quickly overwhelmed. The fighting was fierce, brutal, but Enzo and Katerina, with the help of Alessandro and his men, fought their way to freedom. They escaped the villa, leaving behind a scene of carnage and destruction. They rode away on the motorcycles, the wind whipping through their hair, the city lights blurring past. They were alive, they were free, but they were scarred, both physically and emotionally. The battle had taken its toll, leaving its mark on their bodies, on their souls. Enzo, nursing his wounded arm, had visible marks, but the deeper ones, the ones etched into his heart from years of violence and betrayal, those he hid, even from Katerina. They reached a new safe house, a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, far from the reach of their enemies. They were exhausted, battered, but together. The scars of the past were a constant reminder of the battles they had fought, the flames of the future, a beacon of hope, a promise of a life they were determined to build, together. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. They had won a temporary reprieve, a chance to regroup, to heal, to plan their next move. The future was uncertain, but their love, their bond, remained unshaken. It was a love forged in fire, tempered by adversity, a love that would either destroy them or make them invincible. Chapter 16. The Tangled Web of Deceit. The mountain cabin was a refuge, a place of healing, both physical and emotional. Katerina tended to Enzo's wound, her touch gentle, her eyes filled with concern. The bullet had only grazed his arm, but the close call had shaken her, a stark reminder of the fragility of their lives, the constant danger that surrounded them. Enzo, while outwardly stoic, was visibly affected by the battle. He was quieter than usual, withdrawn, his thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. He knew that Salieri wouldn't give up, that their escape was only a temporary reprieve. Katerina understood his silence, his preoccupation. She knew that he carried the weight of responsibility for their safety, for their future. She tried to give him space, to allow him to process his emotions, but she couldn't help but worry about him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them, Katerina decided to break the tension. "Enzo," she said softly, "talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and something else, guilt. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," he said, his voice low. "If Alessandro hadn't arrived, if we hadn't escaped," she reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was cold, his grip weak. "But we did escape," she said. "We're alive, Enzo. We're together." He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Salieri won't give up, Katerina," he said. "He'll keep coming after us. He'll try to hurt you, to get to me." She squeezed his hand, her heart aching for the fear she saw in his eyes. "Let him try," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid of him, Enzo. I'm not afraid of anyone. As long as we're together, we can face anything." He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. "You're so strong, Katerina," he said. "Stronger than I ever imagined. Stronger than I am." She leaned in, kissing him softly. "We're strong together, Enzo," she said. "We complement each other. We complete each other." He pulled her close, holding her tightly, as if he were afraid to let her go. She felt his body tremble slightly, and she knew that he was struggling with something he wasn't telling her. "Enzo," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "What is it? What's wrong?" He hesitated for a moment, then sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something about my father." Katerina's heart pounded in her chest. She had a feeling that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything, would unravel another layer of the tangled web of deceit that surrounded them. He told her about a secret, a hidden truth that his father, Don Carlo Costa, had kept buried for years. A truth about his involvement in the death of Katerina's uncle, her father's younger brother, a man she had never known, a man whose death had been attributed to a rival family. "My father, he orchestrated it," Enzo said, his voice choked with emotion. "He used my uncle's death to further his own ambitions, to solidify his power. He framed another family, starting a war that cost countless lives." Katerina stared at him, her mind reeling. Her own family, caught in a web of lies, manipulated by a man driven by greed and ambition. And Enzo carrying the burden of his father's sins, the guilt, the shame, the knowledge that his own family was responsible for so much pain and suffering. The tangled web of deceit was even more intricate, more insidious, than she had ever imagined. And she was caught in the middle of it, torn between her love for Enzo and the loyalty she felt, however strained, for her own family. The revelation threatened to shatter the fragile peace they had found, to drive a wedge between them, to destroy the love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness. Chapter 17. A Glimmer of Hope in the Abyss. The revelation of Don Carlo Costa's treachery hung heavy in the air, a suffocating weight threatening to crush the fragile bond between Katerina and Enzo. Katerina stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart aching with a mixture of betrayal, anger, and a strange, unexpected sense of understanding. "Your father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He killed my uncle and framed another family," Enzo nodded, his eyes filled with a pain so profound, so raw, that it took her breath away. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, his shame palpable. I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not until recently. Alessandro, he found some old documents, some hidden records.
He showed them to me.
Katerina reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was cold, his grip weak. She squeezed his hand, trying to offer some comfort, some reassurance, but she didn't know what to say. How could she possibly reconcile her love for Enzo with the knowledge that his father was responsible for the death of her uncle, for the years of bloodshed and suffering that had followed? "I'm so sorry, Katerina," he said, his voice choked with emotion. I understand if you hate me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain, the guilt, the self-loathing in his eyes. She saw the man she loved, the man who had risked everything to save her, the man who had shown her the true meaning of freedom. "I don't hate you, Enzo," she said, her voice firm. "I could never hate you. You are not your father. You are you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope, a flicker of relief. He pulled her close, holding her tightly, as if he were afraid to let her go. "But your family," he said, his voice hesitant. "They'll never forgive me. They'll want revenge." Katerina knew he was right. Her family, the Espositos, were known for their fierce loyalty, their unwavering commitment to tradition, their thirst for vengeance. They would never accept her relationship with Enzo, especially now, with this new revelation. "I don't care," she said, her voice resolute. "I don't care what they think. I don't care what they want. I choose you, Enzo. I choose us." Her words, her unwavering declaration of love, were a balm to his wounded soul. He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a love that would transcend even the deepest betrayals. But even in this moment of intimacy, of reconnection, Katerina knew that their journey was far from over. They still had to face their families, they still had to expose the truth, they still had to fight for their future. "We need to tell them, Enzo," she said, her voice serious. "We need to tell everyone. We need to expose your father's lies and my father's complicity. We need to break the cycle of violence and hatred." Enzo nodded, his expression determined. "You're right," he said. "But it won't be easy. It will be dangerous. They'll try to stop us. They'll try to kill us." Katerina looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "Let them try," she said. "We're not afraid, Enzo. We have the truth on our side. And we have each other." A glimmer of hope, a fragile spark of light, had emerged from the abyss of their past. They had faced their demons, they had confronted the darkest secrets of their families, and they had emerged stronger, more united, more determined than ever. The road ahead was still fraught with peril, but they were ready. They were ready to fight for their love, for their future, for a world free from the lies and betrayals that had haunted them for so long. They were ready to face the storm, together. Chapter 18. The Bitter Taste of Betrayal. Armed with the truth, Enzo and Katerina prepared to confront their families, to expose the decades of deceit and manipulation that had shaped their lives. It was a perilous undertaking, a gamble that could cost them everything. But they were determined to break the cycle of violence, to forge a new path, a future free from the shadows of the past. They decided to call a meeting, a gathering of all the major families, the Espositos, the Costas, the Salieris, and several others who had been caught in the crossfire of their long-standing feuds. It was a bold move, a dangerous proposition, but they believed it was the only way to expose the truth, to force a reckoning. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a grand, dilapidated palazzo that had once belonged to a powerful family, now long gone. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with suspicion, with the unspoken threat of violence. Katerina and Enzo arrived together, their presence causing a ripple of shock and disapproval throughout the assembled guests. They stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly, their faces set with grim determination. Don Antonio Esposito, Katerina's father, glared at them, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. Marco Salieri, his eyes cold and calculating, watched them with a mixture of contempt and something else, a flicker of fear. Don Carlo Costa, Enzo's father, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. He was an imposing figure, a man who exuded power and authority, a man who had built his empire on lies and violence. Enzo stepped forward, his voice ringing out across the room, clear and strong. "We are here today," he said, "to expose the truth, to reveal the lies that have been festering within our families for generations." He then proceeded to lay out the evidence, the documents, the hidden records that Alessandro had uncovered, revealing his father's involvement in the death of Caterina's uncle, his manipulation of the other families, his orchestration of a war that had cost countless lives. The room erupted in chaos. Accusations flew, denials were shouted, threats were made. Don Antonio Esposito, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Enzo, his hands reaching for his throat. "You traitor!" he screamed. "You dare to accuse my friend? You dare to betray your own family?" Caterina stepped in front of Enzo, shielding him from her father's attack. "He's telling the truth, Papa,"
she cried.
"Don Carlo Costa killed my uncle. He used us all." Don Antonio stared at his daughter, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. He couldn't believe that his own daughter, the daughter he had raised to be obedient and loyal, was siding with his enemy, was accusing a man he had considered a friend. But the evidence was irrefutable. The other families, initially skeptical, began to see the truth, to realize the extent of Don Carlo Costa's deception. They turned on him, their anger and resentment boiling over. Don Carlo Costa, his empire crumbling around him, his lies exposed, his power shattered, looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else, a flicker of pride. "You," he whispered, his voice raspy, "you were always weak." Before he could finish his sentence, a shot rang out. Don Carlo Costa slumped forward, his body lifeless, his reign of terror finally over. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at the shooter, their faces frozen in shock and disbelief. It was Marco Salieri. He stood there, a smoking gun in his hand, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating gleam. He was a liability, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. A loose end. "Now we can move forward." Caterina and Enzo looked at each other, their hearts sinking. Salieri had seized the opportunity, had taken advantage of the chaos, had eliminated a rival and positioned himself to take control. The bitter taste of betrayal filled their mouths. They had exposed one monster, only to unleash another. The fight was far from over. It had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 19. Redemption's Fragile Embrace. The death of Don Carlo Costa, at the hands of Marco Salieri, sent shockwaves through the assembled families. Salieri, with a cold, calculating efficiency, had seized control, positioning himself as the new power broker, the man who would dictate the future. He had silenced a threat, eliminated a rival, and consolidated his own position, all with a single bullet. Caterina and Enzo, reeling from the sudden turn of events, knew that they were now facing an even more formidable enemy. Salieri was ruthless, ambitious, and utterly devoid of conscience. He was a snake, a predator, and they were his prey. "We need to leave," Enzo said, his voice urgent.
"Now.
This place is no longer safe." They slipped away unnoticed, amidst the chaos and confusion, escaping the palazzo, the scene of betrayal and death. They returned to the mountain cabin, their refuge, their sanctuary, but the sense of peace, of security, had been shattered. They were fugitives, hunted by Salieri, by their families, by the very world they had tried to change. They were alone, isolated, their future uncertain. Caterina, despite her fear, remained resolute. She had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. She had found her strength, her voice, her love, and she would not let Salieri, or anyone else, take that away from her. "We can't give up, Enzo," she said, her voice firm. "We have to keep fighting. We have to expose Salieri, just like we exposed your father." Enzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and despair. He was tired, wounded, both physically and emotionally. He had lost his father. He had been betrayed by his own kind, and he was facing an enemy who seemed invincible. "I don't know, Katerina," he said, his voice weary. "I don't know if we can win this. Salieri, he's too powerful. He has everyone in his pocket." She reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was cold, his grip weak. She squeezed his hand, trying to infuse him with her strength, her determination. "We have something he doesn't have, Enzo," she said. "We have the truth. And we have each other. That's all we need." Her words, her unwavering belief in their love, in their cause, rekindled a spark of hope within him. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, and he saw the fire, the passion, the unwavering determination that had drawn him to her in the first place. "You're right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We can't give up. We won't give up. We'll fight. We'll win." They spent the next few days planning, strategizing, reaching out to the few allies they had left. It was a desperate gamble, a long shot, but they had no other choice. They discovered that Salieri had been manipulating the other families for years, using his alliance with the Espositos to further his own ambitions, to build his own empire. He had been playing them all, pitting them against each other, while he secretly amassed power and wealth. Caterina and Enzo, with the help of Alessandro and a few loyal followers, managed to gather evidence of Salieri's crimes, his corruption, his betrayals. They prepared to expose him, to bring him down, just as they had brought down Don Carlo Costa. But Salieri was one step ahead. He knew they were coming after him, and he was ready. He launched a preemptive strike, sending his men to attack the mountain cabin, their refuge, their sanctuary. The battle was fierce, brutal, a desperate fight for survival. Caterina and Enzo, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a courage and determination that surprised even themselves. They had nothing left to lose, except each other. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, when Salieri's men were about to overwhelm them, a new force entered the fray. It was Don Antonio Esposito, Caterina's father, and a group of his loyal men. He had finally seen the truth, had finally realized the extent of Salieri's treachery, had finally understood that his own daughter and the man she loved were the only ones who could save them all. Together, Caterina, Enzo, and Don Antonio fought back, driving Salieri's men away, securing their victory. It was a fragile victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was a turning point. Don Antonio's change of loyalty offers a chance. A thin chance. Redemption's embrace was weak, but it was there. The war was far from over, but a shift had occurred. A glimmer of hope had appeared on the horizon. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The alliance, fragile as it was, between Caterina, Enzo, and Don Antonio Esposito, marked a turning point in the war against Marco Salieri. Don Antonio, his eyes finally open to the truth, had joined forces with his daughter and the man he had once considered his enemy to fight a common foe. The reconciliation between father and daughter was tentative, awkward, filled with unspoken regrets and lingering resentments. But there was also a newfound respect, a shared understanding, a common goal, to bring down Salieri and to break the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued their families for generations. They knew that Salieri would not give up easily. He was cornered, desperate, and therefore even more dangerous. They had to strike quickly, decisively, before he could regroup and retaliate. They planned a final confrontation, a showdown that would determine the fate of their families, their future, their love. They gathered their forces, a motley crew of loyal followers, disillusioned family members, and those who simply yearned for a better, more peaceful world. The final battle took place at Salieri's heavily guarded estate, a fortress of power and corruption. It was a brutal, bloody affair, a clash of hearts and loyalties, a test of courage and determination. Caterina, fighting alongside Enzo and her father, discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient daughter, the pawn in someone else's game. She was a warrior, a leader, a woman fighting for her freedom, for her love, for her future. Enzo, fueled by his love for Katerina and his desire for redemption, fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He was no longer the enforcer, the shadow, the man who carried out his father's dirty work. He was a protector, a liberator, a man fighting for a better world. Don Antonio, burdened by guilt and regret, fought with the desperation of a man seeking atonement. He was no longer the proud, unyielding patriarch, the man who had prioritized family honor above all else. He was a father, fighting for his daughter's happiness, fighting for a future he had almost destroyed. The battle raged, the outcome uncertain. Salieri, cornered and desperate, fought with the ruthlessness of a wounded animal. He had nothing left to lose, except his power, his control, his life. In the end, it was Katerina who delivered the final blow. She confronted Salieri, face to face, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, determination, and pity. "It's over, Salieri," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You've lost." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think you've won?" He sneered. "You're just a naive girl, playing at a game you don't understand." She raised her weapon, her hand steady, her aim true. "I understand enough," she said. "I understand that you're a monster, a cancer that needs to be cut out. And I'm not afraid to do it." He lunged at her, his eyes filled with rage, but she was faster. She fired, the shot echoing through the room, silencing him forever. The battle was over. Salieri was dead. The war was won. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high. Lives had been lost, families had been shattered, wounds had been inflicted that would never fully heal. Katerina, Enzo, and Don Antonio stood together, amidst the wreckage of their past, their future uncertain. They had won the battle, but the war for peace, for healing, for redemption, was just beginning. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had taken place. The old order had been overthrown, the new order yet to be established. But one thing was certain: Katerina and Enzo, their love forged in fire, tempered by adversity, would face the future together, hand in hand, their hearts united, their spirits unbroken. The scars remained, a testament to their struggles, but they were scars that told a story of courage, of resilience, of a love that had conquered all. Epilogue. 5 years had passed. The scars of the past, while still visible, had begun to fade. Katerina and Enzo, now married, lived in a modest villa overlooking the sea, far from the opulent estates and treacherous alleyways of their former lives. They had chosen a life of simplicity, of peace, of quiet contentment. Don Antonio Esposito, a changed man, had retired, relinquishing control of the family business to a younger generation, a generation committed to forging a new path, a path of legitimate enterprise, of cooperation, of peace. He visited Katerina and Enzo often, his relationship with his daughter slowly healing, the bond between them strengthened by shared loss and a newfound understanding. Alessandro, Enzo's loyal second-in-command, had taken over the leadership of the Costa family, steering them away from violence and towards a more sustainable, less destructive future. He remained a close friend and confidant to Enzo and Katerina, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. Katerina and Enzo had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who filled their lives with laughter, with joy, with the simple pleasures of family life. They were raising their children in a world free from the shadows of the past, a world where loyalty was earned, not demanded, where love was freely given, not bartered, where peace was cherished, not fought for. One evening, as Katerina and Enzo sat on their terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, their children playing at their feet, Enzo turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a love that had deepened, matured, grown stronger with the passage of time. "We did it, Principessa," he said, his voice soft. "We built a new life. A better life." Katerina smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. His touch was warm, familiar, a constant source of comfort and strength. We did, she agreed. Together. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky ablaze with color. The scars of the past were still there, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made, but they were no longer a source of pain, of regret. They were a testament to their resilience, their courage, their unwavering love for each other. They had created a new legacy, a legacy of peace, of love, of hope. A legacy that would be passed down to their children, to their children's children, a legacy that would forever bind them together, a testament to the power of love to conquer all, to heal all, to redeem all. They were finally free, truly, deeply free. The future stretched before them, bright and full of promise, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the colors of their lives, their love, their enduring happiness. The journey had been long and arduous, but the destination was worth every sacrifice. They had found their paradise, their peace, their forever together.